So in this first session, we are going to be looking at a pretty massive topic. We're going to start off with looking at God's will. And now you might be thinking, flip, that is a huge topic, and what's that got to do with a kind of final year course for students? This is a huge topic, and a quick caveat, we're not going to, in this short few minutes of video, we're not going to cover what Christians have been debating and exploring and disagreeing over for hundreds and hundreds of years. And actually most of this course for you guys is going to be quite practical, looking at what kind of issues do you face as a final year student and then life after uni. But we wanted to start with this, I guess, more theological and more abstract topic of God's will, because actually this is really foundational to who you are as a person and how you're going to live out your journey of life with Jesus. And for those of you who maybe haven't sort of looked at this topic ever before, we're talking about God's will. We're talking about, is God in control? Does God have a plan for the world? Does he have a plan for us individually? And how set and determined is that? Often people talk about, is God's will predetermined and that he has everything laid out, and that whilst we might get confused as humans from our perspective trying to understand what God's doing, actually he is fully in control and he's determined everything and it's happening as he planned it to happen? Or actually is it much more flexible than that we have our own free will, God has a will, and that maybe God isn't as in control, and Christians have had different views over time on it. I wanted to start off with a quote that I love from Tozer. It says this: "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us." I'll read that again. What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Now, what it means by that, when it says what comes into our mind, it's not saying, what kind of fleeting thoughts kind of come into our mind. Actually, it's saying what are the deeply held beliefs about the character and nature of God. And Tozer's saying, actually, what you believe about God is the most important thing about you, and especially around the area of God's will and how you see this applied to your life. I think I agree with Tozer. I think it probably is the most important thing about you. And if this isn't something that you've really thought about before, I'd encourage you in your final year of uni, as you come up to a whole bunch of decisions this year and later on in life, to really dig in deep in trying to understand the character of God and his will, because I do think that it's the most important thing about you. And maybe you don't really think you have any kind of idea of a theology of God's will and how that applies to your life. But I can tell you now, you do have a theology of God's will and how that relates to your life, even if you don't realise it. I'd say all of us are like toothpaste. I love using weird analogies, so this is my first weird analogy. We're all like toothpaste in the sense that, when you squeeze a bottle of toothpaste, when a toothpaste bottle comes under pressure, what's inside of it comes out. And, many Christians will say they believe X and Y and Z about God, and maybe that's actually what they believe. Actually, when Christians come under pressure, when we come under pressure in life circumstances, when things get hard, like a bottle of toothpaste, what is inside of us suddenly comes out. And whether we say what we believe about God or whether we don't really know what we believe about God, actually what we truly believe about God's character and nature comes out when we're under pressure, when we're having to make a hard decision, when things get difficult in life, when we're under those moments of stress. What we in our souls believe about the character and nature of God comes out in those moments and shows whether we trust him or not. So we might say that we believe that God will provide for us and that he's a generous God, but actually we might then take matter, when we suddenly have a moment where we're lacking in our life, we might take the matter into our own lives and do something, to protect ourselves. So when we come under pressure, our theology comes out. So, for example, if you maybe you have a held belief, whether you realise it or not, that God is distant. Actually, God isn't that involved and cares about the sort of details of our lives, that he's actually quite distant. Now, if that's the kind of view you have of God and his will, it means that in your day-to-day life, you're probably not inviting God into what you're doing. Maybe if some really big decision comes up, then you feel, yeah, probably God does care about this because this is a big thing. But actually, the smaller things in my life, I can just make decisions. God probably doesn't really care. I'll just go ahead and do it. Alternatively to that, if you kind of see God as someone who has a set plan for your life, like that he's kind of like written out a story that he is wanting you to live out, then you'll probably spend a lot of your time trying to work out and discern what that is. And actually that could bring up a whole bunch of anxiety and worry. And I know some people, this brings up a huge amount of worry and anxiety because you have in your head this idea that God has this set plan for my life. And as I come to these crossroads of decisions, like if I don't choose the option that God wants for me, like I'm going to mess up, I'm going to fall off, and I'm not going to be in God's will anymore. How do I carry on living? And that can come out when you are under pressure. Or maybe if you believe instead that God is a relational being that actually cares about the big things and the little things in your life, and that he is relational, then you're going to want to invite him into decisions, and there's going to be a discussion there, like in the same way as any relationship. You're going to talk about it, you're going to discern it, you're going to work it through together with God, whether that's a big issue or a small issue, because you see God as relational. So hopefully that's kind of given you a picture already that actually what you believe about God, whether you're conscious of that or not, what you believe about God will affect the way that you live your life in the big and in the little decisions. And I know this is something that I journeyed through a lot as a student, and when I was reflecting on it, I know that actually in many ways my thoughts and processes around thinking about God's will for my life was quite from a selfish perspective, in terms of I wanted to be successful. I wanted to make the most of my time at uni and time after. And often when I was thinking about God's will, I was thinking these are the kind of things I'm passionate about and really excited about, and I want to invite God into that because I want him to bless the things that I care about. I have these different options, and I see this one as being really good. If I invite God into that and ask him, is he in agreement with that? Will he bless that? Because I don't want to do something that then fails. And I was very much approaching God's will from a perspective this is my life, God, will he bless it? Rather than a perspective of God might have a plan for the world. God might have a plan for this city and the church that I'm involved in, and the plan for my neighbourhood. What's God's will for that? And how do I get to join in with that? And I would encourage you, just as you reflect on this topic, think through how selfish is your processing of God's will in your life? Is it very much about I need to discern God's will for the things that I want to do? Or is processing God's will about, God is a being, has a plan. How do I engage with him, discern what that is, and join in with what he wants to do? And I just want to look at two pictures of thinking about God's will. As I say, we're not going to answer any big questions, but there's a couple of ways of thinking about it that I wanted to talk through. So one is the kind of seeing God's will as either an open or a closed model. So what I mean by that is, in a closed model of God's will, that some people theologically would hold to, is that God has a predetermined plan for everything, whether that's in the big macro scale of the world or even to the scale of my daily life. That actually God is the grand author who has written out history before time, and he has everything determined and set out. And when we don't necessarily understand why difficult things or hard things happen, actually that is still God's will, that he's determined all of it, and that we need to come alongside God's will. It's going to happen anyway, and we have to try and figure out why God is leading us down in that particular path. And then the kind of opposite side of that is a kind of open aspect of God's will, which actually saying that God's will is flexible, that maybe I have personal will and choice to do something, and God isn't in control of that. I can make my own decisions, and that God has a will, and that sometimes those align, sometimes they don't. And this isn't a open or closed kind of binary decision. Theologically, there's lots of different views in between, but those are kind of the two halves. And I would lean more towards the open side of God's will, that actually there is an autonomy that we have in our decision making. But I would say that the way I'd caveat that is saying that I kind of believe that God's will has a capital W will and a lowercase w will. So what I mean by that is God's will with a capital W is his kind of overarching plan for the world, that God is someone who has a purpose and a plan for the world and for individuals, that his character and his way of being is unchanging, that there is nothing that can influence or change who he is and how he acts, like he is all-powerful, almighty. But at the same time, I see in the story of the Bible that he is, from page one, a God who creates humanity to have a degree of autonomy and authority. He says, he creates Adam and Eve in his image, but he says, go and rule over, go and make something of the world. And he gives them, he gives them a vocation, he gives them a task to go and make something, and he's letting them make decisions. And, from the first few pages of the Bible, that goes wrong, but that's the risk that God is willing to make, to give humans autonomy in that. So there's kind of like a sense that he is unchanging, but there's also a sense that he is open and flexible as well in his will. And we don't have time in this video to dive into loads of passages of scripture about that, but in this module there's a whole bunch of passages that I just want you to spend some time reflecting on and going, is this a kind of reflecting God as being in a closed system where actually he's determining everything, or is it like an open system? And actually I think you can kind of draw both in the Bible, because I think it is a bit of both. So read those and see where you come to as you pray through that. The second sort of analogy or picture I wanted to give you was whether you think of God's will as a tightrope. So this kind of like long rope that you have to kind of walk on, and like someone in the circus who has to walk along the tightrope. You have to balance on that. You don't want to fall to the right or the left. And some people will see God's will as that, like there's this predetermined set thing for their life that God has for them, and every step, every decision we have to make, like we need to choose the thing that God has chosen for us, because otherwise we're going to fall off God's will. And some people feel that they fell off the tightrope a long time ago, that they're outside of God's will, they've fallen off, they've let him down, and they can't really get back on now. Well, the way I'd think about it, rather than thinking of that rope of God's will that you have to kind of follow indefinitely for the rest of your life, think of taking that rope into a massive field, and that really long rope is kind of making a big long circle boundary around the field. So there's this huge ropes going all the way around the field, and you're stood in that field, you're surrounded by this boundary of the rope, and in that field you can go right, left, forwards, backwards, you can jump up, you can bury a hole if you want, but all of that you're doing within that boundary of the rope. Now you could choose to step outside of that boundary of the rope, and where this picture is helpful for me, like I do believe we can be outside of God's will, like we can choose to do something that is against God's will, and we can be outside of God's will. Yes, we have freedom, so within that boundary, we have freedom to explore the field and do what we want, but there is still a case of like, just because we have freedom within that doesn't mean that we can do anything and that God will bless anything we do. Actually, you can be outside of that rope boundary as well. So that's what I kind of find is a really helpful way of thinking about this, that you can either think through as God's will as being this tightrope and you have to walk exactly down it, and that's God's plan for your life, or thinking about God's will as being this kind of this boundary that where you have freedom to explore within it, and he wants you to take autonomy in exploring that, but you can be outside of it. Now when I say you have autonomy within it, this is a key thing that I want to get across. I think there is a freedom for us to choose, but actually we need to follow the example of Jesus in this. When you see Jesus going about his life in the gospel, he says that he only did what he saw the Father doing. And Jesus was definitely taking and making decisions, but he saw this as a relational thing when it comes to God's will, not a kind of like a black and white, like, is this in the rule book or is it not? Am I doing God's will or not? Like, no, he saw it as a relational thing, and he's like, he invited the Father, and he said, what is the Father doing in this situation? What is the Father's will in this? And I want to step into that. So we have freedom to explore this field, but it's not just us doing it on our own, like we are inviting God into that moment by moment to explore with him. I just wanted to finish on saying that often when we think about God's will, often when we're trying to discern God's will, it's when we've got decisions to make over, do I do this or that? Do I choose that placement or that other placement? Do I do this career? Do I start this relationship with that person? Do I move to this other place? Like, it's very much about doing things. And I do believe that we should invite Jesus into our doing moments, like our decisions about, really big decisions that are important about what we're going to do. But the more I have journeyed this through with Jesus myself, I realised that he is far more passionate about my heart and who I'm becoming than what I am doing. And when we think about God's will, we think more about he cares about the things that we do, but actually I think God's will applies most to our heart. Like, God doesn't want a bunch of robots that will just, he relays the message from heaven and then we just do whatever he's told us to do. Like, he doesn't want just like obedient sort of robots. Actually, what we have from page 1 of the Bible is that he is wanting to form our hearts, and that rather than just inviting God's will into, do I go to that place or that place? Invite God's will into, God, this thing happened today where I felt really bitter towards that person. What is your will when it comes to that person, this difficult decision that I'm in? Like, how should I, shape my heart in this moment? How should I be feeling? Who do I need to confess to? And thinking it from the kind of heart formation side rather than just the decisions and the moments, because God cares, his will cares just as much about that as about what we often come to him about. So hopefully that's the start for 10. Do come back to me with thoughts, questions. I'd love to talk more about this.